Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Cole. Well, it seems like everyone is talking about Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic Socialist mayoral candidate in New York City, that is, who on Monday won the Democratic primary contest for that city. That means Mamdani will now represent the Democrats who usually win in New York City in the upcoming general election this fall. How did he do it? What explains his levels of enthusiasm and volunteering that elevated his primary campaign? And what lessons, if any, can Canadian progressives learn from his victory? To talk about that today, I'm joined by Martin Lukacs, the managing editor of The Breach. Hey, Martin.
Hey, Desmond.
How's it going?
Pretty good. Can't complain. It's not often a leftist wins anything, so it's a good week.
Yeah, I mean, I think among the general lessons that we can take from this victory, the very first one is it never hurts to be young, hot, and well-spoken. So I think if anyone's trying to get lessons from this, that's probably the first one.
Yeah, it was near the end of the campaign when things were starting to look bad for Cuomo.
Andrew Cuomo,
That's right.
the kind of main opponent to Zohran Mamdani and the former governor of the state of New York, and from
Yeah.
a dynasty, political family in that state.
So they put out these flyers trying to cast Mamdani as a dangerous threat, and even they couldn't find a photo in which Mamdani didn't look hot. And it turned into this inadvertent ad for Mamdani. There was one flyer where they even enlarged Mamdani's beard, trying to stoke Islamophobic fears. And sorry, even in that, the man looked fine. Not to keep the cheekiness going on for too long, but there was another response from Bernie Sanders that I enjoyed. He was asked in this wave of now speculation about what's the secret key ingredient for Mamdani, and Bernie said, "I think it's his hair myself. The consultants haven't figured this out. That's why I make the big bucks. I think it's the hairstyle."
He's not wrong.
I don't think there's much else to be said about it. Good guy, photogenic, the hair. Bernie knows what's up.
Those dimples aren't hurting anyone either. I mean, it is interesting that he has gotten this far. He hasn't won. He's not the mayor yet. But as we said, the Democratic candidate in New York City has a huge edge and almost always wins. But, he's broken many conventions, one of which, besides his politics, I think, is just of this image of a non-white person in a position of authority like that in New York City. New York, like Toronto, where I'm sitting today, is a city that's famed for its immigrant population. But I don't believe New York's had very many non-white mayors, and certainly no Muslims. And so just seeing him in this position, just having him being presented in that way, I think is a stark contrast for a lot of people, and a positive one. He describes himself as a democratic socialist, and that's been kind of one of the defining parts of his campaign so far, is this idea that he is willing to very clearly stake himself, Martin, on the political left, to argue for things like free transit, a rental freeze in New York City, where the rents are, of course, soaring. He wants to fight for free buses and just do things and argue for things that are unabashedly of the political left, and was told, I think, by a lot of people that's never going to fly here. As you mentioned, Cuomo has a lot of big donors and a lot of well-connected people in the city who fear-mongered about Mamdani and said that, his campaign is going to destroy the city. He was still able to get to this place of winning the primary, though.
You mentioned some of those policies. I think what was truly impressive about his campaign is it wasn't just a list of, progressive policies. He married those policies, which were simple, specific, and people really understood how they would improve their material conditions, freezing the rent, buses fast and free, public grocery stores. And he married that to a big vision, which really animated and inspired people, a vision of a city that is as expensive as it is in New York, actually being affordable for working class New Yorkers. And I think it was the combo of the two that really helped excite and energize people.
So, Martin, Mamdani had a role within the state legislature previously to running for this position in mayor of New York City. And he was a prominent member of the DSA, which stands for the Democratic Socialists of America. And maybe we should talk a little bit about what the DSA is and how his kind of activities there set him up for this mayoral run.
In a lot of the coverage we've seen so far, especially in the mainstream press, there's a undue emphasis on his, his ability to communicate, his charisma, his good looks, as opposed to, I think, what really matters at the end of the day, which is the organizing base that his team built. His campaign had something like 40,000 volunteers knocking on doors, making phone calls, flyering, doing persuasive style canvassing. It's not rocket science when it comes down to it. If you have vision and a policies that people are excited to turn out for, to work on a campaign, to talk to their neighbors about, it's going to generate enthusiasm. Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016 and 2020 showed that there is a hunger among people to participate in something bigger than themselves, that allows them to connect meaningfully with other people, that allows them to become an agent of change in their own lives. It gives them a chance to taste what collective power might be like. And I think his campaign created a structure that allowed tens of thousands of people to flow into it to become active. And I think their success at doing that was in large part because Mamdani himself and a lot of his key organizers come out of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is an organization that, while it has often emphasized electoral organizing, is an organization that thinks of elections as just one flank of a broader socialist organizing strategy. He was elected as a DSA member to the state legislature in 2020, where he tried to fight for reforms that would help people in the immediate. He kind of famously now was involved in a campaign with the Taxi Workers Alliance, which included a hunger strike to push then Mayor Bill de Blasio to provide debt relief for taxi workers, and a campaign that eventually won. And it's interesting that he, if you read older interviews with him, he very much saw his electoral work as a way of advancing the work of DSA. So I can read a quote from an interview he gave in 2022, where he said, "For me, there's no point in doing this work," namely being a state legislator, "without the DSA. The whole point of being in office is to do the same work that we're doing as an organization, to use the platform and the resources of the office to fight for the same mission, which is the empowerment of the working class and bringing forth socialism in all that it is." So, he kind of saw his role as being an ambassador for democratic socialist ideas. And this was probably the biggest stage that DSA has ever had. Like, they've won several offices at the local level. AOC, of course, was also a member of the DSA. DSA has expanded renters' rights in the state. They've fought for publicly funded renewable energy, but they never really become a mass movement. And I think that's what this campaign did. And I think if it weren't for DSA and an organization that was thinking strategically in that way, that had that broader vision, I don't think Mamdani would have won in the way he did.
I think the interesting thing about it is that we see a lot of people who come from what people might broadly call like community spaces, from organizing backgrounds, from union backgrounds, from tenants' rights backgrounds. And then, they run for office based on that history, based on that record. And we hope when they got into office that they're going to do those things. Whereas Mamdani, as an elected official, was like, as you said, the only reason I'm here is to advance this broader socialist agenda. And it's kind of an ongoing thing. It's not just the platform that got me here. And so I think like people have had more of a reason to believe that he's going to carry forward that work because he's been doing it already as an elected official, rather than getting in on these kinds of backgrounds and then everybody kind of just hoping that it's going to continue on.
So, for instance, in DSA, when you are a member and become an elected, you are obliged, for instance, to commit to showing up once a week for regular DSA meetings. And the rank and file of the organization. In the theory and conception of DSA, is supposed to be a force that elected officials are accountable to, right? Because there's an understanding, which I think is very much correct within DSA, that when you become an elected official, you become subject to all kinds of pressures of conformity, of moderation. You are subject to the pressure tactics of the broader democratic establishment, and the seductions of individual careerism are very strong. And so you can't count on elected officials who aren't anchored in movements and organizations to maintain those principles that they got elected on. And there's lots of debate in the States about the trajectory of DSA. I don't think they've built that accountability mechanism yet. And I think there's been instances of DSA elected representatives kind of going off course, as it were. But the fact that he has this understanding of the role of politicians and of the dangers and liabilities of what happens to politicians when they don't stay rooted and answerable and accountable to movements, I think that will make him a much stronger politician and mayor than if he didn't have that anchor.
Let's talk about some of the challenges that he's faced to get to this point in the process where he's the Democratic nominee now. Primarily going up against a political dynasty in Andrew Cuomo. And that means, having to fight a huge media establishment that was very much suspicious of this Muslim man, talking about socialism, going up against the huge kind of money pouring into Cuomo's campaign to make sure that he didn't win. All of these questions in the media, if you ever saw any of the campaign interviews or the debates that Mamdani had, he was asked repeatedly, not necessarily about his Muslim faith, but about this idea that because he had taken stances against Israel and against the Israeli government and its policies in particular, that he was somehow anti-Semitic, or that he was going to bring anti-Semitism into office with him and advocate for anti-Semitic policies. This became like a central obsession of his opponents, including Cuomo, and of the media. And so he had to go up against all of these things, Martin, in order to prevail.
The weaponization of anti-Semitism, which has always been something that left politicians of recent years have had to face, unfortunately, was again kind of flung in his face. I think quite grotesquely, because Mamdani so evidently is someone who is rooted in a diverse, multiracial environment, organizing environment in New York. He is full of the Jewishness of New York. And so to me, it was just so shameful that would have been flung in his face, as it was repeatedly, including on his appearance on the Stephen Colbert show. And I think to his credit, even though it was clearly so utterly baseless, and he still responded in a very smart and savvy way to it. I think one of the ways that he did it was that his response was to critique Israel in the terms of liberal equal rights, which I think was very smart and actually speaks to a broader strategy about how he tried to make alliances with liberals. So, for instance, when he was repeatedly asked, "Do you think Israel has the right to exist?" which is an utterly nonsensical propagandistic question, because no state anywhere in the world has the right to exist. States are recognized in the international system of states, but states which are just institutions constructed through violence have no moral or legal right to exist. But very interestingly, he answered it by saying, "I believe that Israel has a right to exist with equal rights for all."
Right.
And he answered, he had very, very different variations. I believe that Israel has a right to exist as a state that offers equal rights to all of its citizens. And I think, one thing that was about, I think, was a recognition that the left can't win on its own, but that it needs to make alliances with liberals. So we saw that not just in his answer to those attacks, but in how he struck an alliance with Brad Lander, and how he co-opted the the very, very fashionable abundance agenda in a way to appeal to a broader alliance, because he knew that the left on its own couldn't win on such a momentous scale as the New York primary. And I also think that the really heartening thing about him being attacked through the weaponization of anti-Semitism was that it showed that it can't work, or that in this case it didn't work. In a city that is as Jewish as New York, it was honestly exciting to see that attack failed. And I think that will be heartening and demonstrate to people that you can stick to your principles when critiquing the state of Israel, and not be afraid that you will be taken down by fake accusations of anti-Semitism.
Certainly, I think this is the biggest stage where that's been tested and has failed in terms of like the tactics of saying this person is unqualified or should be disqualified in the minds of voters because of their views on the state of Israel, even though it's a like New York City mayoral campaign.
We've been seeing like right-wing pro-Israel accounts be like, all the Jews are going to flee. They're going to move to Florida. I'm like, yeah, good luck finding bagels in Florida.
Well, but it is, I agree with you. It is heartening, but because this is not over yet, because this was an internal party primary, we have to expect that these kinds of accusations and fear-mongering tactics are going to continue. There were rumors that Cuomo, if he lost, would run as an independent, because he doesn't have the Democratic banner anymore.
Yeah, besides the anti-Semitic accusations, Mamdani basically went up against the full clout of the political and media establishment. Everyone from the New York Times to the New York Post going after him. There were millions upon millions of dollars from super PACs, from the same donors that give money to Trump flowing into his campaign. And I think just today, hedge fund billionaire Bill Ackman said that he and his associates were ready to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the campaign, into the general election in the fall, for any aspiring politician who wants to position himself on the national stage. I think his exact line was, "The risk reward of running for mayor over the next 132 days is extremely compelling, as the cost in time and energy is small and the upside is enormous." So yeah, by no means is the fight over. I think you're going to see the entirety of both the Democratic and Republican establishments try to snuff out this tremendously exciting progressive populist campaign before it actually gets to the next stage.
There have been rumors that Eric Adams, the former scandal-plagued mayor, is going to run as an independent, and they or his other opponents may try to revive some of these narratives. So we'll see what happens. But I think you're bringing up an interesting idea about where I wanted to go next, which is like, moderation. Now, the whole question of how Mamdani dealt with these attacks related to Israel, it was kind of like emblematic of a broader theme in his campaign, which was running as a democratic socialist, but then also knowing how to say things and campaign on things that brought in a wider group of people than just those maybe who would be like a DSA member or volunteer or somebody who identifies as a socialist or a Bernie bro. He was really skillful and strategic. And I actually want to give an example here about the way that Mamdani talked about the police, because he was accused from the outset as being a defund the police kind of campaign, right? And again, Cuomo and others tried to smear him with that. And what he actually did in response was to say, no, I'm not defund the police. In fact, I plan to work with the police. But the problem is the police are doing the wrong things. The police are focused on doing things like dealing with people who are homeless, focused on people with mental health issues, and that's not their core responsibility. That's not what they know how to do, and I'm going to shift them basically back to their kind of primary function. And this is interesting to me, Martin, because it's probably not what a lot of people in a more left circle want to hear. We've been talking about defunding and in some cases talking about abolishing police for the last 5 years. And so when you have a candidate who says, I'm a socialist, but then says, I'm going to work with the police, I'm sure that that can sour a lot of people. That can turn people off. And it can even make people feel like, well, that guy's a sellout. He doesn't really believe in, what the kind of left values on this issue are. But can you win in New York City? Can you win anywhere in the United States of America by saying, I'm going to defund or I'm going to abolish the police? His approach is very clearly detasking the
Yeah.
police. He never used that word, but that was the energy that he gave. And I think that that was a strategic consideration that he had to make in order to be viable to a larger group of people. And I think it's probably a successful formula politically.
Yeah, I was impressed by how he did try to redefine public safety, which is something in the forefront of people's minds. He, yeah, as you said, articulated a case for police not being the ones who respond to mental health calls, that there should be a detasking of the police, that there should be frontline responders who are responding to that, and cops should be assigned to other duties. Which of course is not the full scope of the case that many of us on the left have made, but it still made a case for them, but a skillful case for them.
And the reason why I think it's important is because just like what a mayor of New York's stance is on Israel, the police in question is not necessarily the number one issue in that campaign, but it can be disqualifying if people think you're giving the wrong answer. And I think it's a good lesson for people because we project our desires onto political figures and we want them to be all of the embodiments of things that we believe, but they're probably not going to win if they say these things or put out these positions that a great many people in the general public see as disqualifying. And I think that the lesson is that the movement has to build itself up more to the point where it is okay for a candidate to talk about something like detasking, dare I say defunding. But we're not there as a movement yet, and we can only ask candidates to move kind of generally at the speed of what the movement has built and what the general public is going to think is kind of in that window of allowability.
I think that's a good point. I do think that we we live in a society where we put all kinds of undue expectations on individual politicians, really impossible expectations often. I do think there are politicians who can broaden the Overton window, can take ideas that are percolating on the left and make the case for them, legitimate them in the broader public's eye. I think there are other instances where with public grocery stores, an idea that is usually bandied about by food policy nerds, he was able to take an issue that is actually quite commonsensical, I think, to most people, even though it's quite radical, and build a public case for it. So I think, politicians can be the spear for movements in certain cases, but we shouldn't expect them to do things where the groundwork hasn't been laid by the left.
Okay, let's think a little bit about what this can mean outside of the context of New York City and, frankly, the United States of America. We are here in Canada. People are watching this race. People in, national newspapers here have been writing responses to Mamdani's, his primary victory. And I think, Martin, that there's often this really annoying kind of pattern that we do in Canada when something happens south of the border and we're just kind of like window shopping and we see something we like and we're like, oh yeah, I want that. Yeah, that would look good on me. Yeah. And it's like, it's really annoying because the contexts are very different. The politics and the opportunities and the histories are all, the systems they're different.
Yeah.
So we can't just look at Mamdani and start like thirsting, which is, I think, what a lot of us do, and being like, oh, like, I want that. I mean, maybe we do want that. I want that. But like, how do we actually make an analysis or an understanding of what happened in the United States that translates into something that we might use here? How do we look at this victory in the primary without just, getting to basic and being like, we should have what they have.
Yeah, I agree with you that I've always been a bit dismayed by the kind of derivative politics that some parts of, Canadian progressives engage in vis-a-vis the US, and just trying to create carbon copies of what they're doing. That being said, I've always been someone who thinks it's very important to have an internationalist outlook, where you are trying to see what is working well elsewhere in the world, whether it's Spain or the UK, or even the US. What made it work well, and while understanding the specific context that it came out of. Over the last few days, there have been people tweeting about, I think prompted by Ontario NDP leader Merritt Stiles, posting congratulations for Mamdani, despite the fact that she kicked out the closest thing the party had to a Mamdani, namely Sarah Jama. People posted in response that, oh, you'd probably kick out Mamdani if he was part of your caucus. What's funny is, like, Mamdani wouldn't even have been initially vetted to become a candidate for the NDP. They would have found some reason to disqualify him. Probably the fact that at one point he said the slogan, globalize the Intifada. So I think that's the first thing to know about the NDP as it is. And the other is that I actually think we have a good example in Canada that I think speaks to the dangers of Canadian politicians just trying to cut and paste what they see happening in the US without really understanding it. And I think that's Jagmeet Singh, the now former leader of the NDP. Jagmeet and the consultants around him were people who didn't come into politics with a clearly defined visionary political program. In the first few years, they actually tried to follow the playbook of Justin Trudeau, boasting about boxing or wrestling skills, the Hopi slogans, the making a show of, public media access to candid private moments. They really tried to follow the Trudeau formula. And then I think Jagmeet and the consultants around him were drawn to AOC because they saw the energy and excitement that she generated. But I think they mistook the form for the substance, which is, I think, what we could see happen again now. So with Jagmeet, we got the hotness and the hipness, but without the holistic politics, without the anchor of a broader vision, without the commitment, more important than anything else, to actually building and fostering a grassroots movement. There were even some collaboration moments where he played the video game Among Us, live streamed it with AOC, but didn't use it for political education. So it's the form without the substance, and we even eventually got some more social democratic policies in the last few years from the NDP. But again, removed from that vision, removed from an attempt to genuinely channel people's anger at the corporate elite into organizing, canvassing, building a movement. And that's, I think, the risk of, as you put it, trying to grab for shiny things because we see them working elsewhere.
Listen, man, I'm just worried about whether or not Drake is going to accept Jagmeet's apology for going to the Kendrick concert. So he's got some serious things to consider in his post-political life.
What's hilarious as a perfect comparative contrast was when Mamdani did an interview with Pitchfork a few weeks ago. He was asked about the Drake and Kendrick feud, and as a perfect example of his message discipline, he turned the question into one about affordability. That's the way to do it. Whereas, Jagmeet has probably found his true calling, which is an Instagram influencer who is enmeshed in mid-celebrity online feuds.
I wish him the best of luck, honestly. But I do think that your point about form over substance is really, really, really important. You can't just transpose things. I remember the headline in the mid-aughts, "Where is Canada's Obama?" That's what we want to do so often. We just want to take the vibes and we just want to transpose them over here. But what I think would be really smart, whether we're talking about the federal New Democrats, speaking of Jagmeet Singh, they are without a leader now. There is going to be a leadership race. Or maybe people are looking at this at the municipal level in their cities and be like, well, we could run a campaign like this locally. What I would say is, okay, 40 to 50,000 volunteers. That was the rumor
Yeah,
of how
40,000
many,
volunteers. Yeah.
yeah, of how many Mamdani had been able to recruit for this primary. Listen, that is brilliant for a couple of reasons. The first is that they're almost all young people. So a traditional group of people that don't vote as much are now being recruited to be the face, the public face going out into the world of the campaign, getting their peers to vote, using all of the really brilliant and modern social media strategies that his campaign used, right? So I would say to people who are thinking about how you replicate this, you've got to actually talk to people who are between the ages of like 16 and 30 and ask them in your milieu, what would get you to come out and give your time and volunteer and actually listen closely to what they say? That is what energized this campaign. That's what led to a signature promise about a rent freeze. He listened to young people. There's so much talk in Canadian politics, right? About, like young people not being able to afford a home, afford a home, afford a home, afford. That's the only freaking thing that I ever hear people in this country talking about
Yeah.
when it comes to somebody under the age of 40, is that they would like to be a homeowner one day and have equity, and they can't get that equity. How do we get them into that equity? I don't fucking care, man. Like, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about rent.
Yeah.
Right? About people who are never going to own a home. Let's actually talk about like environmental issues and the concerns that younger people have about what's going to happen to the future of this planet. But yeah, canvas young people, whether that be inside your party, inside of the municipal border that you're thinking about these ideas, and ask them, like, what would get you out to support somebody, to volunteer, to give your time and your energy to try and convince other people that this is a thing? Because the youth turnout is like a huge reason why this man is in the position that he's in. And when you have an army of young people who are willing to give their time and energy, like, that is a huge, huge advantage that most political campaigns never see.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the other really beautiful thing about this campaign is that it convinced people that change is in fact possible. I think that's perhaps the biggest ideological obstacle that we face on the left. People are attracted to progressive and socialist ideas, but they just don't think they can happen. And I think Mamdani's victory will have reverberations of the right kind in a lot of places.
Well, it's been very fascinating to watch thus far. As I said, it's not over. He still has to win the actual general election coming up in the fall. But it's been really fascinating to watch what's happened with him so far and to think about how we can apply it more broadly to our own politics. So I think that's a good place for us to end. But thanks very much for discussing this with me this week, Martin.
Thanks, Des.
If you like what you've heard on The Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you would like to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.